Can science explain everything? A response to John Lennox. The purpose of this video is to respond to the book by John Lennox, Can Science Explain Everything, in the EPUB format. I will respond to all the bits that fit one of these categories. Arguments against atheism, arguments in favor of Christianity, a statement that is important for any of the above. In page 11, Lennox defines atheism as a lack of belief in God, which I agree with. In page 13, Lennox first provides a quote by C.S. Lewis. It asserts that scientists believe in laws in nature because they believed in a lawgiver, which would be God. The purpose of this argument is to show that science falls in line with theism more than atheism. However, this argument fails because people see the universe has patterns. Theists reason that the cause of that is a creator. That doesn't mean that it is indeed why. It is just a speculation. Atheists do science just the same without making this speculation. Then Lennox introduces an argument to say that science can't answer everything. His argument goes somewhat like this. If Aunt Matilda bakes a cake, scientists can analyze the cake, but they can't know why Matilda baked it. But why Matilda baked the cake is still a scientific question in the realm of psychology. It is still something that science can tackle. Perhaps what Lennox means is that using science we cannot analyze God because science might be limited only to the universe. But that would only be true to the degree that science can interact with God. Following John's example of Aunt Matilda, can scientists see Matilda? How would they know she actually made the cake to begin with? Another possibility is that Lennox means the type of question is not scientific. Perhaps it's a philosophical question, for example. However, if that is true, that creates a new problem. Philosophy on its own is unreliable. It can create reliable things, but it is not itself reliable. Science is a reliable product of philosophy. So, it might be that the problem is with the question and not with the limits of science. Then, Lennox right afterwards provides these questions as examples of non-scientific questions. How did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? The first one seems to me scientific. The other two are just unclear. Now, in page 23, Lennox explains why believing in God is not the same as believing in the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. At first, he just describes an encounter where... Yes, sir, what is your question? But isn't it the same as believing in Santa? Put your hands up if you believe in Santa. Put your hands up if you believe in God. Using this anecdote is just an appeal to popularity. And then, the next thing Lennox says is that philosophers wrote extensively throughout history about God, but not Santa Claus. And that is just an appeal to authority. In page 24, Lennox gives a small remark that seems like an argument from design. The idea is that the universe is complex, and when we get to learn about this complexity, it makes it seem like some brilliant creator has made it. However, this argument has two problems. Something would only seem designed if we are familiar with the craft, which is why the universe doesn't seem designed. Human intuition regards intention is not really reliable in contexts they are not familiar with. In page 25, Lennox goes back to saying that science doesn't explain everything. He claims that science doesn't explain gravity, but then it's unclear what would be explaining it. But then, in page 26, Lennox gives another reason why science doesn't explain gravity, because it is incomplete. However, that doesn't mean science cannot explain it. Just right now we don't have the full story. It's different from saying it is just an unscientific question. Then, still in page 26, he gives an example where he is boiling water for the purpose of drinking tea. The question, based on Lennox, why is the water boiling, has a scientific explanation or a purpose-based explanation, explaining he wants tea. I would argue those are not two different explanations to the same question, but two different explanations to two different questions. In page 29, Lennox says laws apply only to things that already exist, because they describe patterns in things. I suppose the purpose of this statement is to argue that the universe couldn't have been created if laws exist without things to act on, and thus supporting the idea that the world needed a creator. There are two separate responses to this argument. In the same way a creator may be transcendent, the universe itself can be transcendent with things inside it included. I can conceive of the law, if there is nothing, there will be something. And that would apply to non-existent things. Then, in page 30, Lennox says atheists avoid the evidence for divine intelligence, and that they do not explain how did the universe come to exist. However, atheists are not convinced about divine intelligence because the evidence goes below their standards. Additionally, atheism doesn't assume the universe is contingent. It doesn't need to explain why it exists because it makes no assertions in the matter. In page 31, Lennox says that asking who created God assumes God is contingent, essentially, which is correct. However, asking how was the universe created or why was the universe created assumes the universe is contingent. It's the same problem. In page 32, Lennox says that atheists criticize theists for using faith while using faith themselves in science. However, there seems to be a bit of miscommunication. The problem is not that believers use faith on its own. The criticism is that they use too much faith, relying on too many premises supposedly. In page 34, he talks about the Gospel of John, writing about eyewitness testimonies of miracles. But he will get into it later, and so will I. Still in page 34, he again claims scientists rely on faith, but we have already replied to the argument. The problem is not the reliance on faith on its own. The problem is additional assumptions theists make that atheists do not. And now, in page 35, we get another interesting exchange, but with a scientist. What do you do science with? My mind. Tell me about your brain. How does it come to exist? By means of natural, mindless, unguided processes. Why, then, do you trust it? If you thought your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided processes, would you trust it? But this is just ad hominem. If something was created by someone stupid or mindless, that doesn't mean the creation itself is stupid or mindless. In page 37, Lennox is about to tell us why he thinks science doesn't mix with atheism. The first argument Lennox provides interprets the DNA as a language, and then concludes from that it might have a creator with a mind. But this rests on this arbitrary interpretation of the DNA as a language. Anything that has repeating patterns inside it can be seen as a language. The next argument he provides is this. Because science seeks to explain complexity with simple terms, atheistic philosophy falls in line with that less than Christian philosophy, because atheistic philosophy is more awkward and complex. This argument has two problems. To say that God created the world is not a simple explanation. It ignores the potentially complex process of creating the world. Science prioritizes certainty over simplicity. Science would rather say something is not known at the time than invent an explanation. Still in page 37, Lennox introduces a quote that suggests that if the mental is not merely natural, then we must rule in the supernatural. However, we don't assume particularly that the mental is not just physical, so we don't have to rule in the supernatural. In page 44, Lennox argues that rational thinking is not confined to science. The purpose of this argument is to transfer the credibility science has to religion. The problem is, rational thinking doesn't create any form of significant credibility on its own. It's a necessary condition, but insufficient when it comes to extraordinary claims. In page 45, Lennox provides an incident from the Bible where cows that recently calved carried a sacred object on their own to a specific place that it belonged to based on their beliefs. They concluded that therefore divine forces are involved. The purpose of this is to show that even if we restrict science to natural tools, we can conclude things about supernatural reality from it. The problem is, this is not scientific thinking. This is just intuition combined with storytelling. Science is not about taking phenomena and attaching a story to it, but to do everything possible to rule out all the hypotheses. At pages 56 to 57, Lennox provides a list of scientists who are Christian despite knowing the arguments against Christianity, then calling it supreme evidence of the Christian worldview. This is not evidence. This is just an appeal to authority. In page 60 in the book, Lennox begins defending Christianity against the problem of evil. However, personally, I don't find at all this problem to be a problem. So, despite the fact it is a very fascinating topic, it will have to wait for another time. Page 62, chapter 7, titled, "Can you trust what you read?" argues that the Gospels are a credible source, but the credibility of a source is irrelevant to whether or not we should believe in miracles. Page 66, chapter 8, titled, "How to Disprove Christianity," is where Lennox explains why Christianity is falsifiable. Based on Lennox, to falsify Christianity, we need to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. But atheism doesn't claim to have a proof that the resurrection did not happen. Atheists' point of contention is the mindset itself that accepts extraordinary claims without scientific evidence. In page 67, Lennox responds to this concern by mentioning science is not only deductive and with experiments, but it is also abductive. The purpose of this argument is to make the resurrection testable by science, so Lennox can prove the case that it's most likely the resurrection has happened. We will now see what his argument is. In pages 67 to 68, Lennox starts to make the case for the resurrection, building on the previous argument that the Gospels are credible. Jesus was witnessed executed on the cross. Jesus was then witnessed when buried. The tomb of Jesus was found empty based on witnesses. Finally, Jesus was found alive based on eyewitnesses. Lennox, in page 73, gets to the appearances of Jesus alive based on eyewitnesses. All throughout this explanation, Lennox says why a natural explanation cannot be likely. He even invokes in page 73 psychological science to explain why it's unlikely to be a group hallucination. There are two problems with this argument. This doesn't demonstrate an unlikely natural event is less likely than a supernatural one. None of this was scientific. Science doesn't settle for eyewitnesses as a sufficient tool to arrive at conclusions about unrepeatable phenomena. In page 80, Lennox introduces the question, why does sin ruin our lives? And then claims that Christianity answers it best based on our instincts and feelings. This is true perhaps for Christians, but not for most atheists. Even if it were true for atheists, it doesn't really provide evidence for the existence of the divine. Finally, on page 92, Lennox offers to test Christianity on a personal level. However, seeing if Christianity affects us positively or negatively only talks about the psychological effect it has. For example, it might be the placebo effect. It doesn't really say anything about the existence of the divine. Fin.